Please give a warm Seattle welcome to Joseph Pierce.
First of all, I think for the benefit of everybody here, I just better correct one thing that Dr. West said. The issue that he showed you, this Austin Review, is issue 1, the September issue. It was launched in September. The January 2002 issue, it will be a Tolkien special. So don't go rushing out the back. You can go out rushing out the back to buy it by all means, but I don't want you to be disappointed. But if you do buy it, it normally retails at $3.95. We're selling it because it's the old issue 1 for just $2, but the subscription details, should you want to get the Tolkien issue in January, are in an insert slip with the American US subscription details. So that sorts it out. Now Tolkien, what inspired me to write Tolkien, Man and Myth, that Dr. West spoke about in such a complimentary fashion, was the fact that there was a major poll carried out in the UK in 1997, where a national television network, Channel 4, and a national book-selling chain, Waterstones, which is, I think, sort of the UK equivalent of Barnes & Noble, carried out a poll to try to find out what was the greatest book of the 20th century. And everybody seemed to be shocked, and many people seemed to be horrified when Tolkien's Lord of the Rings not only won, but won by a significant margin. I think 1 person in every 5 that voted Lord of the Rings as the greatest book of the 20th century. And it beat George Orwell's 1984 into 2nd place, and I think possibly Bryce had revisited it by Evelyn Waugh into 3rd. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, immediately the literati were up in arms and saying this must be a case of the Tolkien Society rigging the poll and getting all their members to vote 70 times. So it's basically many people queued up to dismiss the results as irrelevant. So the Daily Telegraph, which is the largest selling sort of quality newspaper in the UK, it's over 1 million copies a day, carried out its own poll, which was the greatest book, and again Tolkien triumphed. And with 1 million readers, it obviously would be more difficult, but still there were some that, there's this ominous secret society called the Tolkien Society, which is omnipotent and sort of fixes polls. So then the Folio Society, which is a private club of 50,000 members, basically a bibliophiles club, carried out its own poll asking for what was the greatest book of all time. Obviously excluding the Bible. You can guess what's happening, can't you? What's going to happen? Obviously excluding the Bible and what have you, but what was the greatest book of all time, of any century? And of course this is a private club of 50,000 members, and I think even the literati doubted the ability of the Tolkien Society to sign up all of its members immediately to the Folio Society. And again, in 3rd place was Charles Dickens's David Copperfield. In 2nd place was Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and top of the poll, you can guess, was Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Now, this, I say, caused horror in many sort of literary circles. And there were many people sort of dismissing it and saying this shows one person said this shows the folly of teaching people to read. And a reporter in The Guardian made this sort of rather salient, profound point that The Lord of the Rings was without doubt by far the worst book ever written. But I just want to read this one quote because perhaps the older members of the audience may have heard of Germaine Greer, who wrote a best-selling, international bestseller called The Female Eunuch in, I think, the late 60s, early 70s, which is one of the sort of seminal works of feminism. So she saw one of the big guns of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. But her response to it was as follows. As a 57-year-old lifelong teacher of English, I might be expected to regard this particular list of books of the century with dismay. I do. Ever since I arrived at Cambridge as a student in 1964 and encountered a tribe of full-grown women wearing puffed sleeves, clutching teddies and babbling excitedly about the doings of hobbits, it has been my nightmare that Tolkien would turn out to be the most influential writer of the 20th century. The bad dream has materialized. So, I mean, perhaps the secular humanist response to The Lord of the Rings is not all that surprising. These sort of cultural deconstructionists, Tolkien seems to represent everything they disagree with. I mean, the same people would be as dismissive of Christianity, most of them. So perhaps we shouldn't be all that surprised, and perhaps we might be allowed, if it's not too sinful, an element of glee, that they're not that happy with the triumph of The Lord of the Rings. Perhaps a little bit more perplexing is an element of Christian opposition to The Lord of the Rings in some circles. And I think that the sort of reasoning behind this is that, you know, particularly with the current popularity of Harry Potter, that anything with wizards and magic and sorcery has to be in some way satanic. So what I would like to talk about is what is this myth that has baffled and outraged materialists and caused the suspicion of Christians. So that's what I really want to talk about. And I think I'm going to take a three-pronged approach. First, to start by looking at the man behind the myth, Tolkien himself, and then look at his philosophy of myth, and then finally look at the myth itself. Now, Tolkien was very suspicious of paying too much attention to someone's biographical details in deciding whether a book was good or bad. And for the most part, I completely agree with him. But nonetheless, and as I sort of point out in the book, Tolkien couldn't have written The Lord of the Flies any more than William Golding could have written The Lord of the Rings. So there obviously is some correlation between the author and his work, and quite a profound one. So in the book, I started where Tolkien started, because Tolkien wrote about there being a scale of significance in the details of an author's life, and specifically the details of his life. And this is what Tolkien wrote. I object to the contemporary trend in criticism, with its excessive interest in the details of the lives of authors and artists. They only distract attention from an author's work and end, as one now often sees, in becoming the main interest. But only one's guardian angel, or indeed God himself, could unravel the real relationship between personal facts and an author's works. Not the author himself, though he knows more than any investigator, and certainly not so-called psychologists. But, of course, there is a scale of significance in facts of this sort. And Tolkien then divides the facts of his own life into three distinct categories, namely the insignificant, the more significant, and the really significant. And this is Tolkien again. There are insignificant facts, those particularly dear to analysts and writers about writers, such as drunkenness, wife-beating, and such like disorders. I do not happen to be guilty of these particular sins. But if I were, I should not suppose that artistic work proceeded from the weaknesses that produced them, but from other and still uncorrupted regions of my being. Modern researchers inform me that Beethoven cheated his publishers and abominably ill-treated his nephew. But I do not believe that has anything to do with his music. So much for the insignificant facts. Apart from these, Tolkien listed the more significant facts, and specifically the more significant facts which have some relation to an author's works. In this category, he placed his academic vocation as a philologist at Oxford University, which he said had affected his taste in languages, which was obviously a large ingredient in The Lord of the Rings. So we see, that his academic vocation as a philologist was important. It was more significant. But then we have the really important, the really significant factors. And here we have Tolkien again. And there are a few basic facts, which, however dryly expressed, are really significant. For instance, I was born in 1892 and lived for my early years in the Shire in a pre-mechanical age. Or, more important, I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact, a Roman Catholic. So here we see Tolkien, right from the beginning, placing his Christianity, his faith, as the most significant factor in the writing of The Lord of the Rings. So let's just very quickly, because I don't know, some of you may be well aware of all of the biographical, factual details of Tolkien's life, but very quickly go through his early life, because he was born in 1892, his father died in 1896 when he was 4, and he barely remembered his father. In 1900, when Tolkien was 8, his mother was received into the Catholic Church, and both Tolkien and his brother were baptized into the Catholic Church. So certainly someone that writes about converts, I'm always a little bit confused by Tolkien, because is he a cradle Catholic or is he a convert? And I normally fudge the issue by calling him a cradle convert. But his mother died in 1906 when Tolkien was 14. And I think we need to look here at a couple of letters Tolkien wrote about his mother, which may play some relation upon how important he placed his faith. This is a letter he wrote many years after his mother's death, after one of his children had strayed away from the faith. When I think of my mother's death, worn out with persecution, poverty, and largely consequent disease, in the effort to hand on to us small boys the faith, and remember the tiny bedroom she shared with us in rented rooms in a postman's cottage at Rednall, where she died alone, too ill for viaticum, I find it very hard and bitter when my children stray away. And we see here Tolkien alluding to the fact that after she was received into the Catholic Church, she was disinherited and shunned as a pariah by both sides of the family, both her own family and her deceased husband's family. So we have here, 9 years after she died, this letter written by Tolkien. My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it was not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts, as he did to Hilary and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labour and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith. Following his mother's death, Tolkien said he was still only 14 and a minor, and Father Francis Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory became his guardian. He had been a great friend of Tolkien's mother, and Tolkien and his brother lived with a sort of distant relative, and they were never felt really at home there. So every morning they would go down to Birmingham Oratory and serve at Father Morgan's Mass, and then have breakfast with the Oratory Fathers before proceeding to school. So we see that his whole childhood, Christianity was at the core and at the centre of it. Now he married in 1916, and within weeks of his marriage he went off to fight in the First World War and was involved in the Battle of the Somme, one of the most bloody and horrific battles of the First World War, which took place in 1916, and Tolkien referred to this as the animal horror of trench warfare. And again, when we think about people accusing Tolkien of escapism and not being in the real world, we think about how much true gruesome realism he did actually live through, both as an orphan and as a soldier in the First World War. Had 4 children, John, born in 1917, Michael in 1920, Christopher in 1924, and Priscilla in 1929. Now this, apart from being very important to him, obviously, is very important to us, because it was his role as father which was crucial and central to his becoming a writer. We have the Father Christmas letters, which some of you may know, that were published posthumously, but were originally just written in longhand as letters to his children from Father Christmas. Now the first one was written when John, his eldest, was only 3 years old, and it was just Father Christmas introducing himself. Apparently John had asked some question about Father Christmas, so Tolkien, being Tolkien, had answered by getting Father Christmas to write to him. Now of course as children get older they get more suspicious and began to doubt whether perhaps this is Dad doing this. So Tolkien went to rather elaborate lengths to keep the myth alive. And for instance, one Christmas he went out into the garden with a big pair of Wellington boots on and got himself as muddy as possible, and then clumped across the kitchen carpet, the living room carpet, and placed the letter on the mantelpiece and then traipsed out again. And of course the children got up in the morning and were horrified at the mess. And thought, there's no way, that couldn't possibly have been Dad. It must have been Father Christmas. So the myth was prolonged, and it carried on. I mean, it kept up for about 10 years. In the end, he even got the postman involved, because he worked out elaborate North Pole postage stamps, very cleverly decorated, and got the postman to deliver them through the letterbox. So we have this, this wanting to entertain his children, and this was, of course, the motivation for The Hobbit, the children's story, which was a bestseller and established Tolkien's reputation as a writer. So we have Tolkien as a Christian and as a father. These are the two central planks upon which his position as a writer were built, the foundations of it. But we have, on a deeper level, and this brings us to the second part of the talk, his philosophy of myth. And it's important for us to understand this, to really understand where Tolkien was coming from, and also to really understand the power of the Lord of the Rings. And I'd like to start with the 5 words of G.K. Chesterton's, which I sort of have adopted myself as a personal motto when I write books. And Chesterton said, "Not facts first, truth first." Now this is profound, because most people in the materialistic world we live in don't distinguish between facts and truth. They're sort of interchangeable. But this difference between fact and truth is essential for us to understand the power and purpose of myth. For instance, a fairy story can be more real than so-called realistic novels. For instance, in this sort of deconstructionist age, a realistic novel could very well be something which is purely in the author's head and his angst and the result of his own hang-ups, and it can be a complete fabrication of his own distorted, self-centered, subjectivist view of the universe. And this would be called realistic, because it might be talking about all sorts of perversions and things which affect other people. So we can get any sort of realism we get out of it is about how much of his experience we share. But nonetheless, the thing is a product of that one single solitary ego. Now, a fairy story, on the other hand, might talk about something which is perennially relevant across all ages, all fashions, all cultures, to all people. He could talk about betrayal, deception, loyalty, honour, love, sacrifice, and maybe a happy ending, which is always nice. Now, Tolkien wrote about fairy stories. One of his most famous essays is entitled On Fairy Stories. And Chesterton, again, loved using the example of Jack and the Beanstalk, or Jack the Giant Slayer, as an allegory of, if you like, small is beautiful. And we have Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, but we have this whole concept of small people families as opposed to the superstructure of the state, small business as opposed to the superstructure of multinational corporations, small people as opposed to totalitarian states, this perennial smallness, underdog against the big, powerful person. I mean, some of this was discussed very well yesterday by Dr. West. So we see that, that a fairy story could be a good story, but can say things very profound. And of course, the role of story has been sanctified by the highest authority of all, of course, by Christ himself in his parables. And we just take one example, the example of the prodigal son. Now, it's entirely possible that the prodigal son is not factual at all. Perhaps there was never a specific prodigal son that Christ had in mind, or a specific forgiving father, or a specific resentful brother. It was a story. Perhaps those people didn't exist as facts ever. It's not literally true, but it's certainly archetypally true. In other words, that all of us can relate to the prodigal son. We've all been the prodigal son. Perhaps occasionally we've been the forgiving father. Perhaps occasionally we've been the resentful brother. But it's something which is archetypally true and speaks to every generation. It's true, not necessarily factual. So this is where the power of myth comes from. This is where Tolkien was coming from with his philosophy of myth. And Tolkien also talked about the two great powers that are needed for a myth to convey this, to convey the reader along with it. And what, the Greek term catastrophe, and a term that Tolkien seems to have invented himself, eucatastrophe, which is catastrophe with just EU in front of it. Now, a catastrophe is obviously in a story when all of a sudden things go drastically wrong, something horrific happens, and the heroes and everybody else are plunged down into some form of abyss, some form of despair, and the reader feels it with the heroes. They're plunged down with them. The catastrophe, sort of central to all tragedy. But also central to all tragedy is eucatastrophe, this sudden upsurge of joy, when all of a sudden things happen that you weren't expecting but perhaps you were hoping for, and unexpectedly there's this sudden turn in the story, in the narrative, which causes an upsurge of joy both in the characters and in the people taken up with the story. Now, this philosophy of myth had a very profound influence upon C.S. Lewis. And again, I shall be fairly brief about this, because I imagine there's quite a few C.S. Lewis people here that are probably very well aware of the story. But they first met in 1926 in Oxford, and Lewis said that meeting Tolkien forced him to confront two prejudices. He said he was told implicitly when he came to Oxford never to trust a philologist. And he had also been told implicitly from the cradle never to trust a papist, a Catholic. And he said Tolkien was both. So immediately, that friendship with Tolkien was forcing Lewis to ask questions. And Lewis joined a group that Tolkien had set up called the Coalbiters, that basically existed to discuss the Icelandic Elder Edda and the Norse sagas. And so this friendship built from there. And in this time, C.S. Lewis, this was exactly the time when C.S. Lewis was groping and grappling with truth himself. When they first met, he was essentially an agnostic. By 1929, he was now calling himself not an agnostic but a theist. In other words, he believed in God, or a God, probably an unknowable God, but specifically not the God of Christianity. And in 1931, Tolkien, Lewis and Hugo Dyson went out for a walk after dinner in Oxford. And they had a conversation that would change Lewis's life forever. Because Lewis said that he felt the power of myths, but that myths are lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. No, said Tolkien, they are not lies. And this was the beginning of a long conversation when Tolkien said that all myths, because we are created in the image of God, God is creator. Part of this divine image in us is creativity. Therefore, when we create stories, we are presenting a fragment, a splinter of the true light. And that fragment or splinter gives us glimmers of truth. There may be error in it. Particularly pagan myths, there's been no incarnation. They don't have the divine revelation which we as Christians are blessed with. So therefore, they have no choice but to grope and grapple in the dark for these glimmers and fragments of true light which come from God. So myths are a means by which we express our creativity, our divine imageness. But Tolkien went even further and said that Christianity is the true myth, capital T, capital M. You can imagine how profound this was to Lewis, because Lewis, in the same conversation, said myths are lies. And now Tolkien is talking about true and myth and putting them together. And he said, whereas in our myths, the myths of men, we're the storyteller. He said, in the true myth, God is the storyteller, God himself. When we create stories, we use words. God is the word, and he uses facts. So in his story, in his myth, people and events weave the tale, not words. It's myth become reality. We write a story with words, God writes a story with facts. Story, history. So here we see facts not only distinct from truth, but facts serve the truth. When they come from God, facts serve the truth. So the story of creation and of Christ is a myth that really happened. We have the catastrophe of the fall. We have the eucatastrophe of the redemption. We have the catastrophe of the crucifixion. We have the eucatastrophe of the resurrection. And this had a profound effect upon C.S. Lewis, and within I think 12 days of this discussion with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, he wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves and said that he had definitely started to begin to believe in the God of Christianity. And he also said in the same letter that the long night talk with Tolkien and Dyson had a lot to do with it. So we see this philosophy of myth is obviously not merely important as explaining the power of the Lord of the Rings. It's very important in explaining the power to all of us, as in this particular instance, as embodied by C.S. Lewis. Now let's move on to the third part of the talk, which is to look at the myth itself. Now, The Lord of the Rings, obviously The Hobbit was the first book, but The Lord of the Rings, people think that The Lord of the Rings was, the next. But of course, The Silmarillion was the book that Tolkien had been working on throughout the whole of his life. It was his life's work, and it was never finished. It was incomplete at the time he died. He started it right back when he was very young, probably during the years of the First World War, possibly earlier. So the Silmarillion spreads right across his life from beginning to end and was never finished. Now the thing about this is the Silmarillion was the master myth, if you like, the big backdrop within which the Lord of the Rings is just a story. So it's quite important for us to understand the Silmarillion before we can really understand the Lord of the Rings. So very briefly I want to talk about how Tolkien's philosophy of myth and his philosophy of creativity were at the very heart of the creation of Middle-earth, which is right at the beginning of the Silmarillion, the start of the Silmarillion. For Tolkien, God was creator, capital C. We, as creatures, couldn't create anything. We can't create anything. We can't make something out of nothing. Therefore, all that we are is sub-creators. We can mould the creation that God gives us through the things around us, the facts, through the truth inside us, and interpret that with our imagination and mould it like a sculptor into something beautiful, or indeed into something ugly, because gifts, though given, can be abused. So we see right at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, we see that the one, Eru, the one God, creates the universe. But right from the beginning, his first creation are the archangels, the Valar. And from the very beginning, he involves them in the act of creation, the sub-creators. Right from the very inception of the creation of the cosmos, you have this concept of sub-creation. And God conceives creation as the great music, capital G, capital M. And the archangels are used by him as instruments in what can be called a symphonic creation. And perhaps if you're ahead of me, or if you've read the Silmarillion, you will know what happened next. But one of these archangels decides he doesn't want to play in tune. He wants to play his own tune. And at that point, disharmony and discord is brought into creation. We have the fall of Melkor, who was the mightiest of the angels. We have a battle between Melkor and Manwë, who is clearly cast in the role of the archangel Michael. And we see the parallels between Melkor and Lucifer are made even more apparent when Tolkien explains that the name Melkor means he who arises in might. Quote, "But that name he has forfeited, and the Noldor, who among the elves suffered most from his malice, will not utter it. And they name him Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world." End quote. So we see here similarities. Lucifer is the brightest of the angels, means light bringer, whereas Satan, like Morgoth, means enemy. Tolkien's intention, both as a Christian and as a philologist, in identifying Melkor with Lucifer is plain enough. And we have taken his inspiration from the book of Isaiah. And this is Isaiah. "Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy viols. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" And then Tolkien says of Melkor, "From splendour he fell through arrogance to contempt for all things save himself. A spirit wasteful and pitiless. Understanding he turned to subtlety in perverting to his own will all that he would use, until he became a liar without shame. He began with the desire of light, but when he could not possess it for himself alone, he descended through fire and wrath into a great burning, down into darkness. And darkness he used most in his evil works upon Ardar, and filled it with fear for all living things." And as well as this scriptural influence, of course, we have the influence of Augustinian theology in the symbolization of darkness, that evil has no existence in itself, it's merely the absence of good, which is symbolized by light. And shortly after the description of Melkor, Tolkien introduces Sauron, the dark enemy in The Lord of the Rings. Sauron is described as a spirit and the greatest of Melkor's, alias Morgoth's, servants. And then the quote, "But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void." And thus we see right from the very beginning that the evil powers in The Lord of the Rings are specified as direct descendants of Tolkien's Satan. And this, of course, makes it impossible, well, perhaps not impossible because people do it, but certainly implausible to have anything but a Christian interpretation of The Lord of the Rings. And this brings us very briefly onto The Lord of the Rings, because I could talk forever, but I'm sure you don't deserve that. So we have in The Lord of the Rings, immediately we see the Lord of the Rings of the book's title is Sauron, a descendant from Satan. We also see that The Lord of the Rings is set in our cosmos. The one God had created it, Satan had fallen, other angels had fallen. It was a fallen world. So it's pre-incarnation, but it's not pre-Christian. There's a very important difference, of course, because the Christian universe was here before Christ became incarnate. It was the kiss of God at that particular moment that blessed creation again. So we see, the Middle Earth is under the same Trinitarian God. And therefore this answers one of the great criticisms, and one of the most common criticisms from Christians against the Lord of the Rings. Why is there no organised religion in the Lord of the Rings? And it's quite obvious there's no organised religion in the Lord of the Rings because it's pre-incarnation. Tolkien would have had to make his organised religion pagan. And Tolkien wasn't prepared to do that. So far from there being no organised religion being a sin of omission on Tolkien's part, he was avoiding a sin of commission by putting it in. So how do we see the religion in that case in the Lord of the Rings then? What does he do to bring this spiritual dimension to the Lord of the Rings? He presents inklings of Christian revelation before that revelation had been revealed. So before the revelation occurs in history, we see inklings of it. And this must remind us of something, of course. Because the whole narrative of the Lord of the Rings points to Christ, in the same way that the whole narrative of the Old Testament points to Christ. And just as we understand the Old Testament better by reading it through the prism of the Lord of the Rings, sorry, I'll try that again, shall I? Just as we understand the Old Testament better by seeing it through the prism of Christianity, through the prism of the New Testament, the Old Testament reveals itself more fully through the New Testament, so that the Lord of the Rings reveals itself more fully through the New Testament. It's only by reading the Christianity that the author had at the heart and soul of himself can we get the fullness out of the myth itself. So, just before I finish, I just want to really mention very quickly some of the characters in the Lord of the Rings and how this Christianity is hinted at. We've discussed the evil people. We look at the ring itself as a symbol of power, but the symbol of power in many ways is a symbol of ultimate power as sought by Satan and as seduced, and which seduced man. And that's to make ourselves God, make ourselves the centre of the universe. It's the sin of pride, the sin of selfishness. And another writer has called this, that even the shape of the ring is symbolic in that, because it's centred on itself, but in the middle is vacuous. And we see that what happens when Smeagol finds the ring, he's eaten alive by his possessiveness and becomes Gollum. His precious takes over. In the end, he doesn't know whether his precious is himself or whether it's the ring. The thing possessed possesses the possessor. Sin eating at the soul. In the Hobbits, we see the only people that could possibly carry this, because they are the most humble. They are the most reluctant heroes you can imagine, and much rather stay at home drinking and eating too much, and going to bed late and getting up late and having parties. So we have in the Hobbits the exaltation of the humble. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. We see though when Frodo succumbs and wears the ring, all of a sudden he becomes invisible. But he doesn't become invisible to everybody. He becomes invisible to us, but he becomes more visible to the evil ones. So he enters their world. He becomes visible to the eyes of evil. The sinner enters Satan's world. We see in Gandalf, we see this sort of image, the whole concept of the Saxon concept of weird, this sort of early Christian, even pre-Christian concept of providence. We see him as a patriarch, we see his staff, as we might see Moses' staff, has mystical powers. And at the bridge at Khazad-dûm, we see that he gives his life for his friends. He lays down his life for his friends. And in so doing, in dying, because it's not completely clear in the Lord of the Rings whether he dies or not, the wording is so clever. But after he dies, there's also a resurrection. And with the resurrection, there's a transfiguration. Because Gandalf the Grey becomes Gandalf the White. And he's purified by self-sacrifice, and in that new purity, he has more power. I could go on and talk about Aragorn, role of kingship, Legolas, the elves, the role of immortality, Boromir, the role of man in the Lord of the Rings, who is tempted to fall, but pleads forgiveness, is contrite, is redeemed, and dies heroically. We see man on both sides in the struggle. We see man on the side of evil as well as on the side of good. And we see, ultimately, as Frodo and Sam approach Mount Doom, we realise that what we're seeing here in the carrying of the ring is the carrying of the cross. And there's a sublime moment when Frodo can't go on any longer, he collapses. Sam's just about finished. And there's one last heroic struggle before he expects that they're just both going to lay there and die. He tries to lift his master up and miraculously finds that his burden is light. And he can carry him far easier than he could possibly have imagined. So I'm just going to now look at the Lord of the Rings in the wider context. C.S. Lewis said in Surprised by Joy that you can't be too careful. I think he was talking about a diligent atheist, or words to that effect. I'm sure C.S. Lewis experts will correct my inaccuracies here. That a diligent atheist can't be too careful of the books that he reads. And I think we see in the Lord of the Rings a theological time bomb. Because it will be misunderstood and it will be misinterpreted. And people will do awful things with it. And people may use that to show that the Lord of the Rings can be used for evil. But the Bible has been misunderstood. The Bible has been misinterpreted. The Bible has been the excuse for all sorts of evil. We, fallen human beings, are always capable of turning good things into evil. Just as God is always capable of turning evil things into good. But specifically, the neo-pagan, or indeed anybody else, who reads the Lord of the Rings and is a little bit embarrassed by the fact that Tolkien is a Christian and tries to brush the fact under the carpet. That's fine. He can carry on reading the Lord of the Rings on his superficial level. But the more he gets into the book, the deeper and deeper he gets into it, the closer and closer he's coming to the heart of the book, which is Christianity. I just want to end with one quote from Tolkien. Let Tolkien have the last word. Though here at journey's end I lie, in darkness buried deep, beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep, above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell. Thank you.